at the job. I think that might be helpful. But I digress, and I give you Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, I want to ask some questions about facial recognition technology, and in particular, retrospective facial recognition technology. So retrospective facial recognition technology is sold as helping officers identify people from videos or photos of events that have already happened, as opposed to live facial rec, which is scanning and identifying live in the moment at an event. Now, I understand from a Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime decision from August this year that you've paid £3 million for a contract for 4 years for this technology. So does the Met plan to use this retrospective facial recognition technology? And if so, when is it planned to start?
You're quite correct in what you say about the contract being awarded, and we are planning to introduce that. But I think I need to be accurate and say to you, we already use retrospective facial recognition. We've been using it since 2009, along with I think every other police service in the UK, and most forces internationally, I would imagine, use retrospective facial recognition, which is effectively, our main database for that would be the photographs of people that we take into custody. They're photographed, and we maintain that database, and we will then run retrospective recognition tools against that database to see, is this the person in this video clip? Is this the person on this stills photograph of someone who's, I'm making it up, but gunpoint robbery in a corner shop, photograph of the person taken by the CCTV camera in the shop. Can we recognise this person? Have we arrested this person before?
I'll come back to how well it works at doing that in another question. But first of all, I understand you haven't deployed live facial recognition since February 2020. Are there any plans to deploy live facial recognition in the coming year?
There are no specific plans in place, but that's because we would only deploy live facial recognition against an intelligence need to do so. And obviously with COVID in recent years and people wearing masks, facial recognition is not something that we've deployed routinely because of those restrictions, and also the fact that the streets were a lot less busy than normal. But I would anticipate that we return to use live facial recognition in the next few months.
Thank you. Now, just going back to the retrospective facial recognition technology, it's got almost infinite potential to be used on any kind of footage or image, whereas, of course, live facial recognition is only going to be used at a particular location. So have you, and you say that you've been using retrospective facial recognition technology since 2009, have you done any consultation with stakeholders about the use of this technology?
I don't know if we did when it was introduced. I can't speak to that. I'm not sure we would still have the records back then. But I do know that in anticipation of the contract being signed in the next few weeks, we are planning to undertake consultation and communication exercises with a variety of stakeholders, independent advisory groups for race, disability, LGBTQ+, and Met strategic IAGs are aware of this issue and will continue to be consulted upon it. And we will obviously carry out all the required evaluations before we initiate the use of the technology, which I'm hoping will come in sometime in the next sort of 6 months into 2022. Probably a bit longer than that, but certainly mid 2022 we expect the system to be live and in use.
Now, when live facial recognition was brought in London, groups like Big Brother Watch and former members of this committee raised concerns over its use, mainly because it was found to wrongly identify members of the public as potential criminals 96% of the time, and also
I don't agree with that figure, but
okay, well, but I have that figure,
yeah, I'm sure.
from one place, but you may have a different figure. Yeah. But even so, I think we can agree that it's not totally accurate. And in particular, studies have shown that it disproportionately misidentifies women and black, Asian and minority ethnic people. Now, my colleague, Assembly Member Moema, will be raising more questions on the issue of disproportionality a bit later. But I just wonder what lessons has the Met learned from the previous deployment of live facial recognition? Has anything changed as a result?
Yes, I mean, I don't agree with the figures, but I take your general point very carefully and very seriously. I think our most recent research and review of research shows actually that the discrimination against ethnic minorities is lessening all the time. The gender thing does seem to be something that's little bit more perennial. Have we learned lessons? Of course we have. We paid attention to the South Wales court case, which effectively says it's not good enough for a police service using lifetime facial recognition to simply trust the commercial provider. We have to understand what's going on. I think the phrase used is inside the black box, but effectively we need to understand that the algorithm is accurate, how it works, how it's been developed, on what population it's been developed, so that we can guard against the use of a system that is in some way having excessive failures. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. No lifetime facial recognition, or indeed retrospective facial recognition system, is going to be 100% accurate. They're not going to be. But that's well, sorry, just to finish my point. But that's why it's not. You know, we don't identify somebody on retrospective facial recognition and then put them in front of the court and say, here you go, this person's guilty. It's simply part of the evidence, and it may be overridden by other evidence to say, well, actually, that's not the person. So the first thing we would do is, if somebody's identified on retrospective facial recognition, we'd interview them and say, where were you at this time and place? And if they have an alibi that stands up, then clearly there's a problem with the facial recognition. So it's not the definitive. You don't just go straight to jail if you're identified by facial recognition.
You can understand why people are worried about misidentification through facial recognition. Now, we've seen that the software has a low success on people who are not men and are not white. And also tech companies like Microsoft, Amazon, IBM are moving away from selling facial recognition to the police. So are you absolutely sure that the use of this technology is both lawful and ethical, and what processes are in place to monitor the use of retrospective facial recognition to ensure that any implementation is lawful, ethical and effective?
Okay, so I disagree with your characterisation in terms of the levels of accuracy. Our research into the products that we use, which are effectively NEC products, which is the world leader as far as we're concerned in facial recognition technology, shows it to be increasingly accurate and to be of a high level of accuracy. But nonetheless, your question is entirely appropriate. In some respects, I don't have to be convinced that it's lawful and ethical, because the courts have already said that it is. So the South Wales judgment says the use is lawful and the use is ethical. But they've given us some constraints as well, which is something that we, as I said earlier in my answer, we picked up from South Wales judgment, and we are working with NEC and other police services to make sure that we understand the full implications of the judgment. But the judgment was quite clear that police forces can use facial recognition, lifetime facial recognition in that case. And yes, I am convinced that the processes we have in place will mean that our use of facial recognition, both live and retrospective, will be both lawful and will be ethical. We have talked at length with key people such as the Information Commissioner and the various commissioners who look at the biometrics. We have a number of round tables with these groups and other interest groups, and including critics of facial recognition technology, to understand their concerns and try to show them the steps that we take, and they are extreme. You know, if you go back to our use of live facial recognition, we advertised that we were using it. We handed out leaflets. There were signs on the street saying you're about to enter a live facial recognition zone. you know, we're in danger if we go too far. We'll just basically say, if you're a criminal and you're worried about it, please don't walk down this street because there's live facial recognition, which rather defeats the purpose. But we understand there is a confidence issue here, although I do think it's important to say in this meeting that whenever anyone carries out any surveys of the public attitude to facial recognition, the results are always pretty much the same, which is 80% of the public think that the police use of facial recognition, when done appropriately, is a perfectly acceptable technology. Interestingly,
the when done appropriately
yes,
is
when done,
obviously
well,
absolutely critical there.
But I believe we do it appropriately. I think interestingly, this is just reflect back on something you mentioned. Yes, companies are moving away from it, but the Information Commissioner carried out a survey in 2019 into this, and they basically found that on live facial recognition, 82% of respondents found it acceptable for the police to deploy the technology, but only 30% thought it was appropriate for social media websites to use it, which says that we don't want the intrusion in social media, but when it's to deal with trying to reduce crime, keep people safe, reduce terrorism, etc., find missing children, it's something that is worth using.
Now, your website says that you're planning on using images of people who've previously come into custody, and you mentioned that earlier, as a watch list to search against. Now, lots of people end up in custody who pose no danger to society, and their face is on file for 6 years and available for use in the system. I'm one of those people. I was arrested demonstrating against the illegal prorogation of Parliament. But what training will be given to officers who are handling the new retrospective facial recognition software to ensure that it's used appropriately?
Yep, so one of the things that we are doing in relation to that is the initial deployment, and I would stress initial deployment, I don't want to mislead you. The initial deployment of the system will be restricted to a small number of units within the Metropolitan Police Service, and these will be, for example, Met Intelligence, the forensic services and counter-terrorism policing. They already have staff who are very experienced. As I say, we've been using it since 2009. They're very experienced in the usage of it, and we'll only be issuing a limited number of licenses initially as well to authorise officers and staff to use the software to make sure that we introduce it in a measured way. That means we can control the usage of it and make sure that the people that are using it are properly trained in its use, so that we are maximising the technical capabilities of the system, and then we are operationalising that to the benefit of the public.
Thank you. I'll hand over to my colleague, Assembly Member Moama.
Or maybe even back to the chair.
Oh,
Assembly
sorry.
Member Moama, how are you?
Thank you. Before I ask my